بسم الله الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the last part of my series on the events and some of the factors that led to the abolition of the Khilafah on the 3rd of March 1924, which equated to the 28th of Rajab. We've talked about the importance of the Khilafah, the impact on its demise in the world, the view of Muslims at the time, the ideas that proliferated in the tail end of the Khilafah, which permeated people and caused confusion in an era of Islamic decline. We've talked about the internal schisms that some of those did and the reformist ideas brought in. We've talked about its decline in the world in the 19th century and the relationships with Western powers, which were sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, and sometimes two-faced. In this last episode, we're going to talk about the aftermath of World War I. So when we look at this, I remind you of a map I showed you in the first episode, which showed the extent of the Ottoman Khilafah in the lighter brown zone, and how from 1681 through to its remnants by the time we get to the 1914 era before World War I. And in World War I and after World War I, you get to a situation which is pretty much like this. The Ottoman Khilafah has lost all its European territory, Greece, what's in the Balkans, Cyprus. It had lost Egypt before that. It lost Bilad al-Sham, Syria, and Jordan and Palestine and Lebanon. It lost Iraq. It lost the whole of the Hijaz. This was a disaster, of course. The straight line borders marked here illustrate, if you know, how the colonial project worked and how these borders were drawn so that colonial powers could divide and rule with their proxies in the region. So this is how we've come out of World War I to some extent. I mean, immediately after World War I, there was no Saudi Arabia, and we're going to be talking about how some of these states developed. And I want to try and illustrate that there are three tracks happening at once. One is what I've called British diplomacy. So World War I ends in 1918, and between that and 1924, we see a series of diplomatic initiatives by Britain, first under the Treaty of Sèvres and then later under the Treaty of Lausanne, to try and subjugate the Uthmani Khilafah. And at the same time in that period, you have the war between Greece and Turkey, which emerged after World War I. And that in turn has led to the rise of nationalists in Ankara, in the remnants of the Ottoman state, in what would become the new Turkish Republic, against the Caliph in Istanbul. British policy was not just determined by the Khilafah. It was Britain had an eye on what France wanted, what they felt was a threat from the new Soviet Russia, and still their occupation of India, which was crucial for them to hold as much as it could. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920, you can find this treaty online and read it, and it is literally a list of former Ottoman territories which the treaty says is no longer part of the Ottoman. Turkey has no claim over Cyprus. Turkey has no claim over Palestine. Literally one list after another. It was motivated to divide and weaken the Ottoman Khilafah, but some British politicians really had a real hatred for Turkey, and in particular Lloyd George, 1920s, celebrated that Turkey is no more. It was David Fromkin, the historian, says that the Treaty of Sèvres was literally trying to reduce the Ottoman state to a non-entity. And in this treaty, a weakened Turkey and the head of state, then the Khalifa, a nominal Khalifa again, is basically represented as selling out, because in 1920 he's weak, the Young Turks have been overthrown, the state is in huge debt, there's an occupying power there, and literally he's being forced to sign, but he's being portrayed as a sellout and a British agent. And this is important to note because Mustafa Kemal was on the rise at this point as a nationalist and portraying this the Istanbul government as being a sellout. In a similar period, there was Greece, which had kind of got its independence through the backing of Britain in World War I, was breaking away from the Ottoman Khilafah. And Lloyd George viewed supporting the Greeks as almost like something ideological, because he said that British Western civilization comes from Greece, so they welcomed what they thought of as the liberation of Greece. But there was not the same ideological fervor in the British cabinet at that time for supporting Greece. So actually, when Lloyd George left office, the British cabinet withdrew their support from Greece. Up till that point, the Ottomans fighting the Greeks were being backed by Britain. Up till that point, when Britain withdrew its support, Mustafa Kemal, who was the commander of many of the Ottoman forces, managed to hold on to some Ottoman territories and was lauded as a hero and a resistance leader then. So that led to his rise in kind of approval within the remnants of the Ottoman Khilafah. He then went on to establish a power center in Ankara and a national assembly there, strongly influenced by his nationalist sentiments. Previous episode, I explained that even up till this point, his anti-Islamic sentiments were known only to, and very strong secular sentiments were known to people immediately around him, but were not widely known. They were not recognized at that stage. But in undermining Istanbul, Britain invited both governments, the one in Ankara and in Istanbul, to the Lausanne Conference, which empowered Ankara over Istanbul. In the Lausanne Treaty negotiations, it's recorded by some historians that Lord Curzon, the British Foreign Office delegate to that conference, insisted that a condition for recognizing a future Turkish Republic was that it should adopt Western governmental and administrative standards. So this illustrates the kind of thinking that went into these negotiations, which was to crush the Ottoman Khilafah, not just territorially, but also from its Islamic basis. Oliver Dees, writing about Lausanne and the Caliphate, cites this article: no power or jurisdiction in political, legislative, or administrative matters shall be exercised outside Turkish territory by the Turkish government. So again, emasculating the Khilafah just to what is Turkey, for any reason whatsoever, over the nationals of a territory placed under sovereignty or protectorate of other powers signatory to the treaty. So those territories which Turkey had lost, or the Ottomans had lost in Europe, in Bilad al-Sham, in the Levant, in the Hijaz, Egypt, Iraq, they were giving up in this treaty all authority over those, and but it was recognized that the spiritual attributions of Muslim religious authorities were in no way infringed. So it was crucial for the Western powers that at this stage, the spiritual and the temporal authority of the Khalifa be, the Sultan Khalifa, be emasculated. Otherwise, what you would have is these territories taken away from the Ottomans, but the spiritual and temporal power of the Khalifa claiming those back over time. Sometimes the wording of these diplomatic treaties is not explicit, but when historians have analyzed memos and correspondence from the diplomats of the time, including letters between Lord Curzon and the Foreign Office, the consensus of the whole correspondence implies this removal of spiritual authority completely through convoluted, sometimes ambiguous wording. And this wording here is translated from the French original in initial drafts of the treaty. So no power of jurisdiction in political legislation or administrative matters will be exercised by the government of Turkey or authorities for whatever motives, especially for reasons of belief. It is understood the present treaty does not prejudice the spiritual prerogatives of religious authorities of different beliefs. So you can see how there's a focus on the fact that in Islam, the spiritual and the political and temporal are all in one, and that needs to be broken. And in fact, there was this debate amongst the British about whether or not there should be an alternative Khalifa, a spiritual Khalifa only. And this debate was borne out in a Foreign Office handbook from India, they actually raised concerns from India, the India office, that this idea that the caliphate should just be a spiritual authority, like the papacy at that time, separate from the temporal authority. Well, it's not credible, neither from the history of the Khilafah, nor from the utterances of present-day authorities on Mohammedan law, Islamic law, and tradition, does it appear that the Khalifa can be regarded as just a spiritual suzerain. The final sentence implies both words and tone that the British desire that the whole issue might disappear. And they were talking about putting King Hussein, the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, as a possible caliph, which was very opposed by the Muslims of India, because Sharif Hussein was seen as a traitor to the Ottomans. The final sentence of this handbook is, it may become clear that the caliphate as an institution is as dead as the Holy Roman Empire, a voice with no substance. Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India at that time, was warning from India that the feeling on the future of Turkey is growing apace in India, while the British Empire is embarking on a campaign which is not merely anti-Turkish, but seen to be anti-Islam. The debate was whether there should be an Arab caliph or no caliph. So even in correspondence between Curzon and others between 1916 to 1919, the British were saying, we're not in Constantinople. Even if we could replace the caliph, there's no guarantee the Muslims would accept it. Sharif Hussein was the Sharif of Mecca, the governor of Mecca under the Ottomans, who rebelled, allying with Lawrence of Arabia and opening up a second front for the British. He was promised territories by the British after World War I, and there was a debate amongst the British whether he should be backed as a candidate as an Arab Khalifa. He apparently claimed that the Turkish authorities in Ankara would be happy for him to declare himself as a Khalifa. His son, Abdullah, announced after the demise of the Khilafah on the 3rd of March 1924, he announced shortly after that, he declared himself, Sharif Hussein, as an Arab Khalifa, and his son announced that the Khilafah has come back to Arabia. And in doing away with the Ottoman dynasty, the Turks had rendered the greatest possible service to the Arabs. What ugly nationalism is coming out. And he said he felt like sending a thank you telegram to Mustafa Kemal. Actually, though, the British were skeptical as to whether or not Sharif Hussein had soiled his credibility. Early reports of internet discord, despite the optimism of some British observers, one journalist noted, not all of Islam is well disposed to King Hussein and his two sons, the ruler of Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Transjordan, which becomes Jordan today. Within 2 days, an American diplomat had cabled to Washington saying some of the leading Muslims in Damascus had still held that Abdul Majid II, the last Khalifa, was still the legitimate Khalifa. And so they were angered by the fact that Sharif Hussein was declaring himself as Khalifa. And they saw it as a humiliation for Islam, and he's capitalizing on that. So the idea that the caliphate had gone back to Arabia was not really one that took off. And within the Hijaz and the Najd, the whole of the Arabian Peninsula, there was this rivalry between Abdul Aziz ibn Saud from the Najd region and Sharif Hussein from the Hijaz and his sons. And the British had backed both in World War I and with the Ibn Saud before that as well. And one British official wrote, it would be a good thing if Abdul Aziz had established himself in Mecca. After Sharif Hussein laid claim to the Khilafah, they didn't really try to support him openly after that. In fact, his son had been appointed king in Syria, and there was conflict with the French over that, so they didn't really defend Faisal, his son, in Damascus. They let him be overthrown, and later, as we'll see, appointed him as king of Iraq. So Britain had this mixed view about whether or not they should be backing an Arab Khilafah or no Khilafah in the region. Ultimately, they gave their backing to the Saudis, who they supported in establishing a kingdom. Gertrude Bell, who was a travel writer and British spy within the Ottoman Khilafah and in the aftermath in the Arab world, she wrote, and she was personally acquainted with the Sharif family, particularly Faisal. She actually wrote from Baghdad to Whitehall in 1919, if we raise family members of the Sharifian family, Hussein, Faisal, Abdullah, to preeminence, we shall have before long to support them by force of arms against the formidable groups of several dissidents, who she named Abdul Aziz first. So she doubted whether the Sharifan family can reckon on popular or democratic support. So you can see, after having supported them and promised them the world, literally, during World War I, the British were backtracking on them afterwards. They did get, Abdullah was given Jordan, and his family still rules there today. Faisal was originally given Syria, and he was then given Iraq. And Gertrude Bell again writes that she was present in 1920 when Fahad and Ali Suleiman, representative of Arab tribes, were supposed to give the Pledge of Allegiance to this new king, Faisal, who was the descendant of Sharif Hussein in Mecca. And when they did that, they actually gave their conditions to swear allegiance to Faisal because you are acceptable to the British government. It was no heart in it, no loyalty to it. Gertrude Bell comments that Faisal was a little surprised and looked round to her smiling and confused and said, no one can doubt what my relations are to the British, but we must settle our affairs ourselves, as if to say, come on guys, you've got to let me be the ruler, as if that was ever going to happen. The tail end of these negotiations, you can see more commentary from people like Curzon, talking about the Ottoman Empire lay dismembered at our feet, and that Curzon had no desire whatsoever to deal gently with the Turks. The Turks had voluntarily aided Germany. Well, as I said, they had been pushed into the war. They had treated our prisoners with unexampled barbarity. They'd massacred thousands of their own subjects. All of this is disputed, by the way, by historians in Turkey to that extent that it's being presented, and therefore they deserved any fate that was inflicted upon them. So a very vengeful attitude by Curzon, Curzon also was quoted as having said, for nearly 5 centuries, the presence of the Turk in Europe has been a source of distraction, intrigue, corruption, and in European politics, of oppression and misrule to subject nationalities. This is a complete distortion. For that 5 centuries, there was considerable stability and harmony within Europe for its subject nationalities. And in fact, the Uthmani Khilafah was governed over more non-Muslims than Muslims who saw themselves as Ottomans. An incentive, he says, to undue and overwhelming ambitions in the Muslim world. It's encouraged the Turk to regard himself as a great power, which of course it was till about 1800, 1850, and has enabled him to impose upon others the same illusion. It has placed him in a position to play off one power against the other. Perhaps this is alluding to the great diplomatic skills of Sultan Abdul Hamid in the tail end of the 19th century, when indeed it was a weakened power. And he says in their jealousies and in his own machinations to find pretext for his continued immunity. Well, it's all pretty depressing stuff when you see how the Khilafah had demised, how it had come to become such a weak shadow of itself. And if we as Muslims just looked to the reality and to history and the chaos and the death and the misery and instability that has reigned over the Muslim world ever since the demise of the Khilafah and this era that I've been talking about, we would indeed be depressed people and pessimistic people, except that we have the promise of Allah and His Messenger about the return of Islam and the Khilafah. Allah promises this in the Quran when He says, "Ba'da a'udhu billahi minash shaitan rajim, وعد الله الذين آمنوا منكم وعملوا الصالحات ليستخلفنهم في الأرض استخلف الذين من قبلهم وليمكنن لهم دينهم الذي ارتضى لهم وليبدلنهم من بعد خوفهم أمنا يعبدونني لا يشركوا بي شيئا فمن كفر بعد ذلك فأولئك هم الفاسقون." Allah has promised to those of you who believe and do good deeds that He will certainly make them successors in the land, give them istikhlaf, give them khilafah, as He did with those before them, and will surely establish for them from their deen, for them their deen, which He has chosen for them, and He will indeed change their fear into security, provided that they worship Allah and nothing associate nothing with Him. And whoever disbelieves in Him after that promise, they will be seen as the rebellious by Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ talked about prophethood being with the Muslims as long as Allah willed. Then there would be Khilafah ala minhaj an-nubuwwah, that was the Khilafah Rashida. Then there would be hereditary rule, mulkan adan, and then there would be oppressive rule, mulkan jabriyah, and then there would be Khilafah ala minhaj an-nubuwwah, and that would be there to stay. And that when that comes, he said in another hadith that Bayt al-Maqdis will be the capital of the Khilafah. And that indeed, my dear brothers and sisters, is a very heartening point for us to end on and to motivate us to learn lessons from this and to really strive and work to build opinion for an Islamic alternative, a civilization which the world desperately needs as an alternative to look at. In the coming weeks after Ramadan, inshallah, I hope I'll be able to present some alternatives to discuss how that civilization will function, what are some of the facets of it, what are some of the differences between that civilization, the Islamic civilization, and the global order of today, which, as we can see, is causing misery and chaos for huge numbers of people. I hope this series has been valuable and enlightening, and I hope, inshallah ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings some goodness through it for people, and some lessons for us, and we see the return of the Islam as a complete way of life, as a civilization, and the re-establishment of Khilafah, inshallah, as is ordained by Allah and His Messenger. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.